Hello, everybody. On behalf of all the webinar organizers, I would like to welcome you to another session of the AI and Big Data in Finance Research Forum. Today, we are very happy to welcome Vladimir Sokolov from Higher School of Economics and Filippo Mezzanotti from Northwestern Kellogg. Our early announcement mentioned Dmitry Livdan as presenter. Unfortunately, he could not join us today, so we are very grateful for Vladimir for stepping in to present their paper on the economic impact of payment system stress, evidence from Russia. There are 30 minutes for the presenter and 20 for the discussant, followed by questions from the audience. Please send us your questions via the Q&A option and be respectful. We are going to have a small break in the middle of the presentation in case there are any clarifying questions. Once the official recorded part of the seminar is over, we hope you will be able to stay online and join us for an informal follow-up discussion. And now, Vladimir, the floor is yours. Would you like to share your slides?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting us to present this work. And as Svetlana just announced, Dmitry Livdan was called for the university-wide meeting at his university. So he kindly asked me to step in and present this work, this joint work with him and with Norman Shurhov from University of Lausanne. So the topic of the paper is the economic impact of payment system stress, evidence from Russia. So payment systems, they form a backbone of the financial system through which firms and financial institutions exchange their messages to make payments and fulfill the invoices. For example, there are famous and widely known payment systems such as FedWire, Target, FedEdge, SWIFT, and so on. And recently, I should add, there are new coming private systems based on blockchain technology and so on. So payments system becomes the focus of policymakers and also of the academics in the recent area. So most theoretical models which in some way highlight the inner workings of the payment system, they usually assume the frictionless functioning of such systems. For example, this influential paper by Bianchi and Biggio has such an assumption. However, empirically, we know from some big episodes which occur from time to time, such as cyber attack, unfortunate events of September 11, Target outage, interbank market shocks, that payment system function is not always frictionless, and there are shocks happening. The recent academic debate around these shocks occurred around the famous 2019 repo blow-up, and a number of influential studies were covering this episode and how it spilled over into the rest of the financial system. So, a number of questions arise if you take away the assumption of frictionless functioning of the payment system. So first of all, we need some sort of quantification if such stresses occur, and how do they affect firms who make those payments, and how do they affect the network of firms, the firm-to-firm payment flows. Secondly, since we understand that firms form a production network, and then as a result of that, there is also a payment network when they make their payments. So once a shock hit part of the network, how does it propagate, and how a shock amplifies itself through the network? So that's an interesting venue to explore. And then finally, how these micro level shocks, how do they aggregate to the macro level, and how significant could be a shock hitting ability of individual firms to make their payments? How does it affect economy as a whole? So addressing some of these questions, or all of them, is rather important. So why researchers didn't explore these important questions before? Because of the nature of the data of the payment systems. Usually it's highly proprietary and highly confidential. So it's often difficult to get hold of such information and identify all the entities which make payments. So this is where we come in. So we have access. We have access to a little bit old. I'll explain a little more about the data origins and coverage later. But let me just give you idea how the data works itself. What's in the data? What economic mechanisms we can identify with the data. So it's a granular Russian payment system data. Where we have identities of firms making payments, firms receiving payments, and banks on both sides which facilitate those payments. The banks which transmit the payment from a supplier firm from a customer firm to a supplier firm. Okay, and also there is a time dimension, obviously. So essentially, we have, once we have the full payment data, we can identify 3 networks. So one network is a typical, what people understand when they build theoretical models for this type of economy, is the production network. So this is a network of upstream and downstream firms exchanging goods and services. Okay, then they match and meet for production reasons and exchange goods in order to inputs in order to produce output. The second network is the one which illustrated on this graph here. It's a payment network. So once supplier receives receives an invoice from a customer. Once a customer receives an invoice from a supplier, it must wire the money amount for the goods and services through the sender bank and the receiver bank of a supplier. So that's a payment network. And finally, the third network, which exists and is subject of other studies, is the interbank market network. So this is network where banks exchange their excess reserves or fill up the deficiencies in the reserves on the interbank loan market. So naturally, if, for example, one bank receives too much of a payment flows, it will have excess of reserves. Or on the opposite, if bank had many outcoming wire transfers, it'd be deficient of reserves. So for that reason, this is one of the reasons why interbank market exists. So when bank can swap these temporary liquidity shortages and fulfill the liquidity regulatory requirements. So that's a third network which we identify in the data as well, because payment system covers those interbank transactions and clearly identifies them as interbank loans. And that allows us to study how shock to that interbank market affects the payment system shock between the firms exchanging payments for goods and services. And finally, how it affects the production economy, how production of goods and services might be affected. Okay, so here I preview our main findings. So first of all, if there is an interbank market shock, which is reasonably exogenous, it does puts a stress on also firm-to-firm payments. So banks who serve firms in the payment flows, if they're affected on the interbank market, this financial shock also affects firms and their transactions. So and there are 2 channels: direct loss of payments. So if I'm a firm and my bank was negatively hit by interbank market shock, my ability as a firm to conduct payments to my suppliers is directly affected. So that's one effect. Second, since there is a network on the interbank market and in the payment system, there is a second and third round of shocks going through the network, and the initial shock will be amplified. And this will also affect what we call, it will have this effect of a network externality. What we find here is that also that payment shocks, they propagate upstream through this input-output network, and also they change the network structure. So network adjusts endogenously as the shocks propagate through the network. And that has also a secondary effect on the initial shock, as will be illustrated at the end of this presentation. Then we also managed to capture something we call firm's resilience to payment shock. This is elasticity to shock of eigenvector centrality in input-output network. And we rely here on instrumental variable shift share type of estimation. We also present battery of placebo tests to demonstrate that there were no predetermined trends in the data which might affect the identification strategy. And we quantify that shocks hitting firm itself, payment shocks hitting a supplier firm, and shock hitting the customer firm, they have impact on their ability to conduct payments has a different magnitude. So the smallest impact has a payment shock hitting the supplier firm. The second shock in terms of its magnitude, the second effect is a shock hitting firm itself, meaning banks of the firm. And the biggest impact has a shock which hits banks of a customer firm. So customers who pay invoices of suppliers, if their banks are hit and the ability to wire their payments. So one standard deviation shocks hitting banks of customers results in 2.7% decrease in the revenue of this given firm, which is a centerpiece of our empirical analysis. And then finally, when we do this micro to macro aggregation within a theoretical model and parameters from the data, deep parameters calibrated from the data, the estimation sums to 7.5% decline in the overall GDP in this economy. Okay, so this slide illustrates the example of the payment invoice. Used to be on paper, now it's all in electronic. And why we illustrate it here, because it clearly identifies all those subjects I have shown you on the previous graph. It has tax IDs of firms making and receiving payments, so we can uniquely identify them. It has IDs here of bank branches who facilitate payments on both sides, the bank of a sending firm, the bank of the receiving firm. So those identify the volume of payment. And that's what most important for us. These numbers here, they are accounts through which payments are made. And then when we carefully examine them, we realize that these accounts are not random, but rather they correspond to the actual accounting system. And then you can figure out the nature of those payments. So if it's, let's say, for example, payment for tax reasons, is it a payment for business reasons, or is it some other type of payment? So what we do here, we narrow only payments between firm to firm. So we exclude non-private sector, such as municipalities, individuals, and so on. And we only focus on payments for goods and services. So that's the core of our data. And let me now explain the source of the data. It's a bit old, as I said. It's a 2003-2004 data, which was available from Central Bank of Russia at that time. And two influential papers, at least two influential papers, explored that. It's Mironov 2013, Journal of Finance, and Mironov and Jurnavska 2016 American Economic Journal policy. So they explored it in other dimensions, mostly political economy type of dimensions, because you can identify, entities who made those payments. So the data is slightly sanitized. Overall, it comprises 133 million of such payment slips, which we narrowed down later on. It has the names. There are about 1.2 million unique entities who make those payments, firms, individuals, and about 1,500 banks at that time that were present in the Russian banking system, who were serving, facilitating those payments. And the network forms about 630,000 pairs. So we also, because we know tax IDs of the firms, we can identify the location through the address. So we used Microsoft, geolocator and geolocated them. And then it basically this illustrates that geographic coverage is pretty broad. And the sizes illustrates a volume of payments coming out from the area, and mostly corresponds to populated areas of the Russian Federation. So here, our payment system shock. So again, first of all, we have access to that very granular, detailed data. But secondly, well, fortunately for us, but unfortunately for people around that time, there was some widely covered banking panic, and it occurred for reasons not related to the economy performance. It occurred to beginning of so-called cleaning of the Russian banking system, which continued for maybe a decade. So at that time, the Central Bank of Russia started withdrawing banking licenses of banks who were suspected in money laundering. And it withdrew license of these two banks, which were actually mid-size in terms of volume of the economic activities, but were rather central on the interbank market network. And well, reasons they were central because they were involved in money laundering, and they used this interbank market network as in a way a vehicle to clean the money. So regulator withdrew the licenses all of a sudden. It was a shock, and also maybe in a way a little bit in a not a very common way, the regulator also made a public announcement that they will continue, and there are more banks which are blacklisted and also will lose their licenses. So such event and the statement generated this panic, and interbank market collapsed. So this graph illustrates a number of bilateral links before and then after. So it was a significant collapse overnight of activities on the interbank market. And that will be centerpiece of our identification strategy because apparently it didn't come, it came exogenously, but it's also still relevant because it affects banks, and in the end affects firms who are customers of those banks. Here, so in empirical exercises, we aggregate to just 2 periods. It's a daily data, but we aggregate just two periods with basically sum all payments before and after, where these periods I mentioned here. And we create outcome variables is either firm-to-firm payments between those 2 periods, pre and after, and I and J are firms, and V would be volume of bilateral I and J firm payments between these 2 periods. And the formula also is it's rather popular, but maybe still unusual. It's a so-called symmetric growth formula. It's popular because it also comprises exit and entries of firms into the network. And for us, it's important here because we do see a lot of firms dropping out, entering for the first time. So basically, it captures the intensive margin and extensive margin as well. So that's a useful formula for us. Second aggregation we do is at the firm level. So here we focus first on the bilateral level, then just the firm level. When again, we just identify all receipts of a given firm I. We call it revenue in pre-period and the post-period, and calculate the symmetric growth for the firm I. So this would be outcome variables in our regressions. Here is how we construct the shock. So as I just mentioned to you, shock identification comes from the interbank market. So S here is a subscript for banks, I is a firm. So each firm has a number of banks through which it wires its payments. So kappa is a pre-shock volume of payments of firm I going through bank S. So that's the weight. So that's a popular Bartik style shift variable. So weights are volume of payments of firm I going through bank S. And in red, the interbank connection loss is a number of links which bank S loses during the interbank market panic. So that's exogenous shocks weighted by pre-shock volume of payments made by firm I through bank S. Okay, so that will be our so-called payment system shock variable. And then we also create by the same fashion shocks of downstream partners of firm I. So we call them ZI superscript D. So here we have shocks hitting those firms J, weighted by volume of business of the firm I with the downstream partners of firm I. And the same exercise applies to upstream partners of firm I. So we have shocks hitting those partners which are indexed as J, but weighted by volume of business of the firm I with those J upstream partners of firm I. Okay, so we basically have these three shocks: firm itself, and those two shocks, they stand for banking shocks hitting upstream and downstream partners of firm I. Okay, and here it's also interbank connection loss described. It's also built using this intuition of the symmetric growth, where N is a number of links bank S has on interbank market before and after. Okay, here is some summary statistics. The sample greatly reduces because, as I explained to you, we only focus on firm-to-firm payments and for business activities. So a lot of small individual payments are dropped. So from 120 million observations, we go down to 4 million observations. So payment growth is about 16% here. Here also the volume before and after quantification of those shocks we construct according to the formulas I explained to you. And also the you can get a sense of the payment network. So for example, number of receiver firm per sender firm, number of sender firm per receiver firm. As you see, means are a bit skewed to the upper side because of big maximum values. And if we go to the data, maximum values, they stand for such unusual companies such as Royal Roads, utility companies who have many connections. But if you look at the median, these are more reasonable numbers, 40, 50 partners per firm. So here I present to you our first empirical results. So we run Hwaya and Mian type of regression. So here is our outcome variable, which is payment growth between firm I and J. Here would be a shock hitting either firm I or J. So the slash here, basically, this one equation nests two models. One model where we have, for example, firm level fixed effect on the receiver side, and then second model when we have fixed effects on the sender side. And these two panels report those outcomes of those two regressions. For example, the first one. So here we put sender fixed effect, and on the sending side, so we basically the identification comes in this case from variation of shocks within a sender firm. So variation in terms of how strong shock affects the receiver firms. We also include on the receiver side firm industry of the receiver and multiplied by the first, I believe, 4 digits of the postal code. So it's a usual sort of multiplication of this fixed effect controls for the emitted variable bias on the receiver side, and then control variables at the firm level which are observable. So what we find here that shock within a sender firm, if a variation in the shock across receiver firms has a negative impact on the payment growth between firm I and J and amounts to about 4%. If we apply the same regression, but now we use the receiver fixed effect and look into variation within receiver firm and see how the shocks hitting sending firm affects the same payment growth I and J, we see that the magnitude of such shock is 2 times larger. So, so what we first conclusion we get, so in the same network, shocks hitting banks of sending firms or in the production network customers, those who pay for the inputs. So that shock has a more negative impact in terms of its size. The difference in number of observation comes that there are this unitary when there is only one bank per firm, and then fixed effect subsumes such observations. So you need to have at least 2 observations per, let's say, of a receiving firm if you employ, for example, specification with sender fixed effect. So that's why some of these unitary observations are dropped, and that's why slightly different number of in the sample. Second set of results is when we aggregate to the firm I level. So this dependent variable is basically growth of firm revenue between the 2 periods. So now we cannot apply this powerful Quire and Mian identification strategy, which was the main driving force on the previous slide. So here we basically have a cross-sectional regression, and identification comes from apparent exogeneity of these shocks hitting firm I, the banks of firm I, or banks of downstream partners of firm I and banks of upstream partners of firm I. We still include fixed effects for the industry and location of a firm, as well as observable firm characteristics. So first column reports just when we include 2 shocks, shocks hitting banks of firm I, shocks hitting customer banks of downstream firms, and the last column includes all 3 shocks. And again, consistent with the bilateral evidence, the highest magnitude, if we also do standardization below, is highest negative impact when the payment shock hits banks of the customer banks, firms who are customers of a given firm I. Okay, so this illustrates our raw data on the left-hand side. So we have this raw data of payment inflows growth in 2004. And on the horizontal axis, we have magnitude of these shocks, Z. And we do the so-called bin scatter plot. So if we just do the raw scatter plot, it would be just black picture. But the common in the literature is to have, more aggregate, but still still a visually appealing way to present raw data is through the bin scatter plots. What we observe here, it's a quite negative relationship between data points, which were also presented to you through this formal regression analysis on the previous slides. On the right-hand side, we present to you graphical analysis of so-called placebo test. So here we have 2004 shocks hitting firms, but we assign these shocks to the data which we also have for firm payments 1 year before the event, so in 2003. So this is, some people call it falsification type of analysis. So you take a period when nothing occurred, but then assign shocks which happen afterwards. So, and what this graph illustrates, that there were no predetermined trends in the data, and that shocks were hitting firms quasi-randomly. So there is no predetermined variation how shocks were assigned to firms. So indeed, it comes from the banking panic and not the way that firms interact with each other in the first place. Second part of the paper, which my co-authors mostly built, because I'm more of an empirical researcher. So this comes from, maybe Dimitri would have enlightened you much better, but I'll do my best now. We need, in order to have a macro aggregation, we need to build a theoretical model, which we can calibrate and then produce some quantitative result. So we built on two influential papers. One is from Asimoglu and co-authors, which is one of the first papers introducing network into macro economic analysis. And what we add to this rather big strand of literature is separation of factors of production inputs into external factors and internal factors. And then our payment.
Vladimir, sorry, just wanted to quickly say you have about maybe 1 minute left.
Oh, really? Okay, sorry, I've maybe been too long, but I will do quickly. So this is first theoretical contribution. Second, we take a paper of Biggio and Lau, who introduced the access to payment in advance constraint, but make it stochastic. So this payment shock hits the constraint, and it could be binding or non-binding. So that's the innovation. Then we have, again, standard Leontief expansion. And what is new here is that these payment shocks M are introduced. Again, Leontief inverse captures the direct effect and the indirect effect. This graph illustrates, simulates how the model works. So we randomly create 9 firms and randomly assign their revenues. Those are red circles, and blue lines represent payments between firms. And then we randomly hit payment shock originating from a customer firm I, who make payments through the network to its suppliers. And then as the shock propagates through the system, the takeaway from this exercise is the adjustment of the network. After about 70 rounds, it adjusts. And we observe on the right-hand side graph change in the eigenvector centrality of each these firms. And it happened to be that firm number 9 has the biggest loss of its centrality. So, even though the shock hit firm 1, we see that more other firms got more affected, particularly firm 9. So that makes us think about the so-called resilience factor, and which we explore further in the paper. This is our aggregation exercise. So this is a usual economy-wide change in GDP. And the first term is, again, rather common. It basically represents drop in average sales, and it's summation of eigenvector centrality of firms and productivity shocks before and after. And second term comes from our model. It's this payment network adjustment. So basically, it's adjustment coming from what the previous simulation illustrated, that centrality of a firm drops. So, and that has a buffering effect on the payment shock. So that term is novel. So I will maybe quickly skip these calibration exercises, which we do, and then just present that if we calibrate our model, which is in the paper, the impact on the GDP amounts to 7.5%. And these are some conclusions. So the payment system stress disrupts economy rather regularly. We present here the causal evidence coming from interbank market shock, which is reasonably exogenous. And the payment stress propagates upstream, diminishes firm growth, the whole network adjusts and diminishes the aggregate GDP. And we also built a model based on influential paper of Asimoglu, where we introduce internal and external inputs. And we also introduce random access to payment shock in this, well, cash in advance, payment in advance type of methodology. And this type of work could be applicable to future research, who will try to incorporate popular research directions such as cyber attacks. I've seen a lot of papers now coming out about this issue, natural disasters, and possibly for the new private payment systems, which also arise nowadays. Thank you very much. That's all.
Great. Thank you very much. Filippo, would you like to share your slides?
Sure. Well, thank you very much to the organizer to invite me. I think it's, as I mentioned earlier, this was a lot of fun, a great paper to read. So let me go straight to the point and let me give you a little bit of a summary of the paper. So as the author kind of presented, essentially the basic starting point of the paper is this idea that payment systems are really crucial to allow firm and economy essentially to grow and perform well. And again, this idea is, I would say, non-controversial, but the more important part is that we don't really have good measure of the size of these importance, right? Like in economic terms, what would be the elasticity between the efficiency in the payment system, say, and the GDP? And this is important on the downside because, of course, if we have intervention that could potentially disrupt it, like what would be the cost? It's also important in the good side, on the more positive side, which is, say that we have, we have to decide how much to invest in technology to improve this. What would be the benefit that we could accrue to our economy? And what the paper does, they focus on this 2004 interbank panic. I mean, the key part here is this is a shock that is not driven by specific kind of distress into the banking sector or in the economy, if that matters, but it's really driven by these kind of license withdrawal, in particular from one bank. And the reason why this propagated further, it's mostly driven, if I understand correctly the story, by the fact that, yes, one bank was initially affected, but then it was clear the other were probably affected, but there was uncertainty about their identity. And of course, there was uncertainty about the exposure of other banks to this initial bank. And so the bottom line is that the whole system kind of froze. And basic idea that the author kind of explained well is that there is some sort of counterparty risk. So essentially, banks stop kind of conducting transaction with each other. Now, the paper kind of presented this figure that kind of summarized well kind of the magnitude of this size. Again, here they're plotting the number of bank-to-bank relationship. So what's going on here is that as soon as this event happened, you see a large decline, almost like a 50%, actually, not larger, decline in bank-to-bank pair. So this is to say, banks stop trading with each other. And that, of course, could have effect on the firm that have relationship with them. And the way this is actually how they end up measuring their kind of bank level toxicity, which is they actually measure the decline in the number of bank-to-bank connection. So the idea is that if you, before you were normally trading with 10 banks, bank one trade with other 10 banks, now if you only trade with 3, you're more affected than a bank that used to have relation with 10 and now has relationship with 9, essentially, kind of. So what does the paper do? So on empirical side, it essentially show, first of all, kind of at the relationship level, then essentially being exposed to this toxic bank affects kind of the amount of relationship there is between two firms. So, if you're exposed to a bank, companies, either of them, you'll see kind of a smaller amount of trade essentially between them. They're able then to aggregate these up at the firm level. And here they show on the direct side that essentially this direct exposure to the toxic bank kind of lower the revenue growth going forward. But what they also show, which is again kind of to some degree more unexpected, is that there is this indirect effect, which is not, it doesn't just matter essentially whether you're going to be affected directly, but it also matters essentially if your supplier or customer are also affected. That will also reduce your revenue. And what they actually show is that the shock to customer essentially tend to have a larger effect. And then they also have some result about kind of how the input-output centrality, I'm going to come back to this later, also mediate the result. They then have a model, and the model, as the author discussed just now, it's essentially a version of a Acemoglu framework with payment shock we did through this cash in advance, and importantly, with a production function that has both internal and external inputs, right? And this is very important because again, the first use of the model is really trying to explain, at least and I think that's a really nice contribution, try to explain why in this specific model, the shock actually to customer are more important. And the basic intuition is that, essentially when a company experiences a shock, to some degree, they can minimize the impact of the shock by replacing some of the external input with some internal input. So the idea is that it's really more difficult to buy a certain widget from a certain company because of this payment disruption. And so what you can do is that you can make your workers, or you can build something internally to partially replace this. So you kind of change the production function. And intuitively, that will affect, could be more beneficial, it could be more important, of course, if the shock is on supplier side. But obviously, if the shock is on consumer side, this is less relevant or not relevant at all. So again, the model kind of help you qualitatively to understand what is going on, why do we see what we see in the reduced form estimate. And then they also use it to quantify the result, which is they show that, again, the payment shock in 2024, the one they study, essentially had a large impact on the GDP. And they do also an exercise, essentially, what about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the intervention that happened there that also disrupted payment? And they argue that essentially that's the effect there was smaller, largely because the effect was mostly concentrated on foreign banks. So bottom line, I thought the paper was extremely interesting. It kind of really kind of trace out very well, essentially, how does the payment system kind of interact with the real economy? And it provides a lot of intuition about kind of on a positive side, what really happened in 2004 in Russia. And also on the kind of more normative side, I think it gives you some intuition on like, how could you have help or in other scenario, how could you help essentially to kind of minimize, and what could be the implicit cost, in particular disruption in the production function that can arise in this situation. So extremely interesting. So again, bottom line, I want to do this, be very clear up front. I think this is a very interesting paper. I think this is a great paper overall, as all the elements that I think you would want to have it, and actually it's rare to have them all in one paper. You have great data, you have a careful empirical analysis, and you have a very insightful model that they use for both qualitative and kind of quantitative exercise. So, in a way, it's a hard paper to discuss because it's very important, kind of well done paper. So let me throw there a few thoughts, and again, hopefully they could be marginally helpful going forward. So my main comment, as I received the paper, I was thinking like, why was I picked as a discussant? And so the way I rationalized it, which maybe it's not the right one, is essentially, well, it took me actually kind of an hour to figure it out. It was like, oh, actually, I did write a paper on payment disruption too, which is kind of very different setting, but in a way similar. And so, and this is a paper that, it's about the 2016 demonetization in India. The shock is extremely different, of course, but what happened in India in 2016, essentially the government made a policy intervention that reduced the availability of cash in the economy, and so disrupted the payment in the Indian market, and this is kind of largely kind of cash-based at the time. And so what the implication of that shock is that, again, you make it harder to do transaction in cash, but you can still do transaction kind of digitally or with bank transfer. And so now you create a wedge between essentially cash and non-cash. And what you see indeed is that led to a large increase in non-cash transaction, in particular digital transaction, which we kind of, in our earlier paper show, this was kind of very large and persistent and kind of driven by the network effect that can be triggered. And then there is this kind of other paper kind of written at the same time by Chodoraj and co-author that essentially pointed out like this switch from cash to non-cash, it's essentially kind of potentially kind of reducing the negative impact of the shock in the economy. And so then in light of these results, essentially made me think, look, could the same kind of mechanism play a role here? Of course, the story here is reversed, but kind of to put it in perspective, could there be some, could the shock also have driven kind of a reallocation of transaction from one form of payment, in this case, the shock one was the kind of bank transfer, to another form of payment that in this case, the non-shock one was cash. So in other words, I mean, could part of the result potentially be driven by the fact that company, they used to do transaction on kind of using banks, but now maybe they use some cash. And obviously that could be potentially a problem here because if I understand correctly, I mean, they measure everything based on kind of bank transactions, so they don't observe directly cash. Now, of course, one way to kind of potentially do it is that they may have other data kind of on an administrative level, kind of in aggregate, and be able to kind of reconcile that. But at least in principle, it could be something worth thinking a little bit more. Now, I want to be very, very upfront about, do I think this is a big issue? Absolutely not, right? There's different reasons why I don't think this is a big issue, but as I'm going to argue, I think it's worth thinking a little bit more. First is that I think it's unlikely that, again, given the magnitude of the shock, that what happened here is that everybody start doing cash. And maybe there is an easy way to kind of show it on the macro level data, like, things like, was the kind of velocity of cash increase that much that would be able to compensate or something like this, or just kind of provide us some kind of benchmark. Again, I don't think that's likely. I'm sure it may have mattered, but it's implausible to me, at least. Yeah, I mean, at least, I should collect more data, but it seems kind of implausible we could explain all the results. And also, some of the most interesting results are kind of unclear why this switch would matter. The fact that you have heterogeneity between upstream and downstream, not totally clear what that has to do with cash. So this is to say, I don't think this is the kind of a huge problem with the paper, but I think it's something that may be worth thinking a little bit more. As again, the paper, it's already good in many dimensions, so the margin of adjustment are limited. So let me throw there two ideas of things they could do or potentially at least think a little bit more. The first is, do they see any evidence that the effect is larger where the substitution with cash is easier? Like the type of model I have in mind is a slightly different version of their own, which is there's a shock where the bank shock increased the cost of bank payment, but did not completely shut down. And so if you're a company, or say you're two companies, and one essentially has more available cash option, this company will tend to kind of leave the network essentially more because they can replace it with cash. But if you have no alternative, or the alternative is very expensive, you're less likely to do it. And so how could they look into this? I mean, in practice, obviously the author know the data better than me, so they'll be better to design, a test here. But I'm wondering, like, for instance, one intuitive thing is like, if my partner is a company that is down the street from me, it's possible that I walk there and we talk about it, be like, okay, bank transfer are difficult now. Can we do it in cash? Obviously, if the company is in Moscow and the partner is in Siberia, that may be less of an option. So maybe there is something there to kind of explore about co-location. And the other thing is that, of course, there is things about cash rich versus cash pool company. Some company may have a lot of financial resources, some company not, and so maybe there is something there also to do. Now, again, the point of showing this, looking into this heterogeneity, is a way to say, well, if there is no heterogeneity, then of course that suggests that maybe this is like a third, fourth order problem. And if there is some heterogeneity, it could still be important to use it to kind of think about quantifying it. Now, another idea which is kind of related to my initial comment is about persistence. And in my version of my mental model about persistence in this case is that if everything is going on here, okay, I'm taking an extreme stand here, but if everything is going on here is just companies switching to cash, I would potentially expect that there is very little persistence. Why? Because the idea is that, well, in that extreme scenario, no relationship would really cut. And people just switch from bank to cash. And so as soon as bank transfer will be available, you're just going to switch back. Again, by review preference, this company clearly preferred bank transfer to cash because that's what they were doing before. So in a way, if there is like absolutely no persistent, very quick recovery, that could be consistent with the fact that a lot of things were not really disrupted, or at least they were disrupted in the banking sector, but they were kind of quote unquote successfully replaced. Now, if there is persistent, that seems to be suggesting that, you know, some of these relations were really broken down. And why? Because essentially, if you need to replace cash, you know, in the paper, there seems to be two ways. You can get a new partner. And of course, if you find another company that could be your partner, some of these new relation will stick. Like I used to have a supplier, I get a new one. In some cases, this new relationship will be good. And so, of course, I keep it. Or like the paper argued, it could be changing the production function. Of course, once I change it once, I may not want to change it a second time. So in a way, overall, kind of persistent to me seems to be consistent with this idea that the shock was really kind of disrupting the relationship and not just simply replacement. And so, of course, you can look into this, but I think one thing that could be, you know, again, it's very hard to me to suggest the test. I mean, it may be also hard to measure persistence given the data. Again, I don't know how much time, you know, how much, you know, data do you have available after the shock to potentially measure this? I mean, of course, they need data sufficiently in long run as bank go back to quote unquote normal. But I think one thing they could just look is like how many new relationships are formed here, because it's actually a story in which it's simply like, oh, they're replacing bank transfer with cash payment. You intuitively should not see a lot of new relationship. But if companies are very constrained here, they should be looking for new partner, new supplier, new customer. And so you should see in the data a lot more essentially of these new established relationships. That would be another way to kind of look at that. Kind of bottom line on my kind of broad point here. Again, I think this is worth thinking a little bit. Again, I don't think this is like a, you know, and as I said, maybe the author could also kind of upfront kind of thinking about how not very plausible as this as like explaining a lot of the result. So, but I think it's worth to kind of think a little bit more. Again, as I said, this is maybe one of the few margin of adjustment where the paper can be improved. My second point is that I think one of the most interesting things, at least for me, reading the paper, was this idea, the combined empirical result that the customer shock was more expensive for firm, and the kind of theoretical explanation that the reason why this happened is because companies are adjusting their production function. I think this is a kind of really nice result, very interesting. My only comment here that I think would, again, is pushing the paper even forward is, could you provide exactly direct evidence on the change in the production function? And again, there could be a way to think about this empirically. Again, one example, kind of intuitive example is what to explain what I really mean here is that, well, I'm thinking that if I'm a manufacturing and the relationship with the steel supplier, so raw material supplier is disrupted, it may be difficult for me to kind of change the production function because you need steel. That's kind of a necessary input. But I think the story they're putting down here in the paper is that, well, but if the shock affects you in intermediate goods, what you can do is kind of replace that intermediate supplier by still buying the steel and then maybe having more worker or something else that essentially stepping, or maybe changing the production so you don't need that intermediate supplier. So what I would like to do is like, can they show me more of this kind of thought experiment in the data to map it to the result? I think that would be, again, it may be very hard, but would be very nice. Again, here, the author will have a better idea for me, the data constraint, the data availability. So they may be better. So I don't want to constrain it in my comment. I'll just throw them there. If they're helpful, they can use it. One thought I add is that you can have the heterogeneity across across industries in essentially the dispersion in the production function, which you can look potentially by looking at the dispersion on the input. So what I'm thinking about here is that at the extreme, you may have an industry where every company consumes the same share of input. And that's because there is just one way to make that product. And then you may have another industry when you see more dispersion. And I think, the mechanism the author suggests is that, well, in the second category, it may be easier to do this adjustment because essentially you have more option to choose from. Again, I don't know how easy this is to measure, but that could be something to think about it. Another idea is about multi-product versus single product firm, because an important margin of adjustment, much more kind of simple, is that if you do multiple product, you get disrupted in some of your input. You may still be able to do one product, but not the other. What you could do is reallocate resources to the new product. So I don't know if they can look at that, but my prior is that you should see larger effect in single product firm versus multi-product firm. Again, maybe not, And then the other thing is that they have this measure of network centrality. In a way, I think that that's the way they're thinking. The network centrality, to me, it's inside this discussion, but right now it's not very well. I think it's not very well explained. Intuitively, I understand that if you're more central, it may be harder to adjust, but I think there should be a little bit more work to kind of explain the way this test essentially fit this story, or what is exactly the story they're trying to make. Again, if they can do a little bit more on the direct evidence, that's the way I was referring to, that would be interesting. I have a few minor comments, but let me just point it out too, the last 2 minutes and then conclude. The first is that, again, this is more a technical, well, not really technical, but it wasn't clear to me how did they actually measure this Domar weight, which you use it for measuring the centrality. And also the other question that I have, I'm not being an expert in this area, is to what extent, is this just a relationship share? And if so, is this maybe just capturing companies that are large versus smaller? Like, in a way, centrality, is it really centrality, or is just size in this case? And this is more of a kind of general comment, is I think, again, and this is I think about as a positive of the paper. I think the paper it will be for general interest. I think a lot of people will read it. And I think, in the rewriting of the paper, I would ask them to maybe kind of push more detail and kind of more background on kind of the production network kind of theory, to make sure that everybody's the same page. So making sure everything is defined, because sometimes, again, I had fun kind of reading some of these other paper to inform myself, but it wasn't super easy to follow. And the other kind of part of the minor comment, this is like kind of, I put in minor because this is purely speculation. They do this comparison between 2004 and 2022. And their basic argument of the difference has to do with the type of banks that are affected, foreign banks only versus essentially kind of most of the other. And again, this is not kind of in the model directly right now, but I wonder if part of the difference, and if that's something worth incorporating or not, at least given that this seems to be kind of something that people are thinking about, is could part of the difference be driven by the option that are outside the banking sector? So, between 2004 and 2022, obviously a lot more kind of crypto option to transfer money across firms that do not depend on kind of the traditional payment system. And so is it, again, this may like push the paper in a direction that may just be outside the boundary they think are appropriate. But I'm wondering if like it's sort of a general tendency to bank dependency could be partially a reason here. I have some minor comment. I'll show this slide. I mean, these are kind of really, really minor. So I'll just conclude, given that I'm already at 20 minutes. So what does the paper show? It showed me that essentially shock to the payment system can have very large impact on economic activity. And these shocks are essentially propagated through the production network, potentially forcing companies to use less efficient production method as a way to essentially, compensate some of the shock. So, and I think this is kind of interesting. It's kind of a hidden cost of the payment shock. And overall, as I said, it's a super interesting paper. I recommend everybody to read it. It's going to be of interest for a lot of different folks. And I think it's a great paper to make a PhD read, because it's like, as all the elements you would potentially want a paper to have, there is, again, great data, kind of credible identification, very big question, but also model use both from the qualitative and quantitative standpoint. So to me, it has been a real pleasure to read it. And I hope that the comments are somehow marginally useful for the author to kind of push it a bit more, but it's already an interesting paper, and I'm thanking you, the author, to write it, and the organizer to invite me to read it.
Great. Thank you very much, Filippo. Wonderful discussion. Unfortunately, our official time is up, so there's no more time for Q&A questions. So I would like to thank everybody for joining us today, and of course, special thanks goes to Vladimir and Filippo. So we hope that you have enjoyed our session today, and very much look forward to seeing you next time. Our next session is going to be on December 12th. We're going to have Nancy Wallace presenting her new work on the wildlife risk of California residential real estate, casualty insurance, risk management, and mitigation. So please check out our website for all of the additional details. We're going to stop the recording now. We hope that you can stay for a few more minutes and join our informal post-seminar discussion, where you can ask additional follow-up questions. We're going to upgrade all the remaining participants to the panelist status so that we could all see each other and have a nice chat. Thank you very much for joining us today. Goodbye.